The Banker's Double Life, a Hercule Poirot Mystery. Chapter 1. The Guests of Ravensmere Hall. The autumn light over Surrey had turned the colour of weak tea by the time the motor cars began to arrive at Ravensmere Hall, and Hercule Poirot, standing at the tall window of the morning room, with his hands clasped neatly behind his back, found himself already forming small, precise opinions about each new arrival. He had come at the invitation of his old friend Colonel Hugh Ames, a genial widower of military bearing who kept a modest cottage on the edge of the Ravensmere estate, and had, for reasons Poirot privately suspected, had more to do with loneliness than sport, insisted that his Belgian friend join him for the weekend's shooting party. "You will like old Thorncastle," the Colonel had promised in the motor car from the station. "Self-made man, built that private bank of his up from nothing after the war. A trifle pompous, perhaps, but generous to a fault, and this weekend he means to make some grand announcement. Retirement, I shouldn't wonder, handing the reins to young Gerald." Poirot, who found little pleasure in shooting, and considerably more in the study of human character, had accepted with courtesy and private curiosity. Now, watching the gravel sweep before the house fill with polished bonnets and liveried chauffeurs, he began his silent inventory. The first to descend was a lady of perhaps 50 years, dressed with the severe elegance of someone who had once been beautiful, and had decided that dignity must now stand in beauty's place. This, the Colonel murmured, was Mrs. Beatrice Thorncastle, wife of their host. She moved across the gravel with the particular grace of a woman accustomed to being watched, yet Poirot noted that her gloved hand trembled very slightly as she adjusted her hat, and that her eyes went first, before the house, before her husband's outstretched hand of greeting, to the upper windows, as though counting them. Behind her came a young man scarcely 30, fair-haired, handsome in the loose, unfinished way of young men who have never quite been made to work for anything. Gerald Thorncastle greeted his father with a heartiness that did not reach his eyes, and Poirot observed the swift, calculating glance the young man threw toward the house, as a man might glance at a debt collector's office he was hoping to avoid. "Gambling," the Colonel murmured under his breath, with the satisfaction of a man imparting delicious gossip. "Cards, mostly. Racing too, I hear. His father's paid his debts twice already, and sworn it was the last time, both times." A third motor delivered Mr. Charles Renner, Edmund Thorncastle's business partner of some 20 years. A spare, grey, watchful man, whose handshake with his host was correct to the point of coldness. Renner's eyes, Poirot noted, went not to the house, nor to the other guests, but to Thorncastle himself, with the fixed, searching quality of a man trying to read a ledger written in a hand he no longer trusted. There followed Miss Cynthia Thorncastle, a poor relation, niece to the banker, dependent upon his goodwill, dressed in clothes a season too old, and worn with the particular brightness of a woman determined that poverty should not be read upon her face. And Miss Vivian Marsh, the private secretary, dark-haired and self-possessed, who carried herself through the introductions with the practised invisibility of a woman who has learned that in certain households to be noticed is to be dismissed. Last of all, arriving not by motor but on foot, having walked, it was explained, from the village station to save the cost of a cab, came a slight young woman of perhaps 24, dressed in grey, introduced by Mrs. Thorncastle with a certain vagueness as Miss Ferrand, who is to give Cynthia her music lessons this month, and who Mr. Thorncastle was so good as to invite to stay, since the roads are so bad this season. Miss Alice Ferrand had dark, watchful eyes, and spoke English with the faintest, most careful precision of someone raised partly abroad. She said very little, and what she said, she seemed to weigh first upon some private scale. It was Edmund Thorncastle himself, however, who most engaged Poirot's attention. A big, florid man of 58, moving among his guests with the booming, expansive good humour of a man who has built an empire and means everyone to know it. And yet, Poirot thought, watching him greet Miss Ferrand with a handshake half a second too long, a smile that flickered and did not quite settle, there was beneath the banker's heartiness something else, a watchfulness. The look, Poirot decided, of a man keeping several accounts in his head at once, and uncertain that they would balance. Poirot. Thorncastle's great hand closed over his own that evening as they were introduced properly in the drawing-room. Ames has told me of you, the great detective. Well, you've come to the right house for entertainment, though I promise you no murders, Only my little announcement tomorrow evening, which I flatter myself will surprise a few people in this room. His eyes, as he said it, moved, swiftly, and only for an instant, to Charles Renner, and then, more briefly still, to the slight grey figure of Miss Ferrand standing near the fire. Poirot said nothing, but the little grey cells, as was their habit, had already begun, quietly and without his willing it, to take notice. Quick heads-up, detectives. I've put together an exclusive collection of mystery stories created especially for my biggest fans. These are brand new cases you won't find on YouTube. If you love clever clues, shocking twists, and impossible mysteries, check the pinned comment or the description to get your copy. Now, let's jump into today's case. Chapter 2. The Announcement That Never Came. Dinner at Ravensmere Hall was, on the surface, everything such a dinner ought to be. The candles reflected a dozen times in silver and crystal. The conversation bright and general. Edmund Thorncastle presiding at the head of the table, with the satisfaction of a man surveying a kingdom entirely of his own making. Yet Poirot, seated between the Colonel and Miss Cynthia Thorncastle, found the evening a rich study in undercurrents. Mrs. Thorncastle spoke almost exclusively to her other neighbour, and twice Poirot saw her gaze travel down the table to where Miss Ferrand sat, quiet and correct, eating very little. Gerald drank rather more wine than the evening required, and laughed rather more loudly than his jokes deserved. Charles Renner ate methodically, said little, and once, when Thorncastle made some jesting reference to putting the books in order before I'm through with them, set down his fork with a small, precise click that carried, in the sudden lull of conversation, further than he perhaps intended. "You'll all know by tomorrow evening what I mean to do," Thorncastle announced over the port, when the ladies had withdrawn and the gentlemen remained with their cigars. His face was flushed with wine and self-importance. "I've kept my own counsel long enough. There are things a man owes, to his family, to his partners, to himself, and I mean to settle every account before I'm a day older. Every account, gentlemen." He said it with a heartiness that seemed, to Poirot's ear, to strain very slightly at its own edges, like cloth stretched one thread too far. Renner's expression did not change, but his hand, resting on the tablecloth, closed slowly into a fist, and then, with visible effort, opened again. "Settling accounts, Edmund," the Colonel said pleasantly, quite innocent of any undercurrent. "Sounds ominous. I thought we were promised your retirement, not your confession." Thorncastle laughed, too loudly. "A man may confess to good fortune as well as bad, Hugh. Tomorrow you shall all see." And he would say no more, turning the conversation with the practised ease of a man who has spent 30 years steering boardroom discussions where he wished them to go. It was later that evening, as the party dispersed toward their rooms, that Poirot, walking the upper corridor toward his own chamber, in no great hurry, for he found houses at night, when their inhabitants believed themselves unobserved, most instructive, came upon a small scene that he did not, at the time, know how to weigh. Miss Ferron stood in the shadow of an alcove near the library door, and Edmund Thorncastle stood before her, his great bulk oddly diminished, his voice pitched low and urgent. "Not tomorrow," Poirot heard him say, in the tone of a man pleading rather than commanding. "I beg you, not before the others. Give me until Monday. I will do right by you, I swear it upon your mother's memory. Only not in front of—" "You have said that before," the girl replied, very quietly, and there was in her low voice something that might have been grief, or might have been something colder. "You said it 2 years ago, when she was still alive to hear it." "I have waited long enough, Mr. Thorncastle." Poirot, seeing that he had come upon something not meant for his eyes, withdrew with the silent tact of long habit before either had noticed him. But the little grey cells, he reflected as he closed his own door softly behind him, had been given a very great deal to consider. A banker who spoke of settling every account, a young music tutor who called her employer Mr. Thorncastle, in a tone that carried, beneath its formality, something almost like an old and bitter intimacy, and a reference, light, oblique, yet unmistakable, to a mother now dead, and a promise long deferred. He did not sleep well that night, though nothing in the house stirred beyond the ordinary creaks of old timber settling in the cold, and the distant, mournful call of an owl somewhere in the park. Once, near 2 in the morning, he thought he heard a door close softly somewhere below, the library perhaps, or the study adjoining it, but he could not be certain, and being a man who distrusted certainty built upon half-waking impressions, he made no note of it until later events gave the memory a weight it had not, at the time, seemed to deserve. Lying awake, staring at the unfamiliar shadows cast upon the ceiling by a guttering candle he had not troubled to extinguish, Poirot found his mind returning, again and again, to the small tableau in the corridor, the great banker reduced, for one unguarded moment, to something pleading and diminished, and the quiet young woman who had answered him with a coldness that seemed, upon reflection, to conceal a very great deal of pain beneath its surface. He thought, too, of Mrs. Thorncastle's trembling glove upon the gravel, of Charles Renner's watchful ledger-reading eyes, of Gerald's forced heartiness, and the debts the Colonel had so cheerfully gossiped about. A house, he reflected, is very like a ledger itself. Every family maintains its own accounts, its columns of affection and resentment, of duty paid and debts allowed quietly to accumulate, and sooner or later, in every such household, someone is called upon to settle what is owed, whether they are prepared for the reckoning or not. Poirot, before retiring himself, paused a moment at the foot of the great staircase, considering the darkened hall below, the closed door of the library, a thin line of lamplight still visible beneath it, and beyond it, somewhere in the sleeping house, the small, private griefs and calculations of a household that had presented, only hours before, so unified and pleasant a face to its own dinner-table. He thought of Colonel Ames's cheerful assurance, offered so confidently in the motor-car from the station, that he would like old Thorncastle, and reflected, with the particular melancholy that came upon him at such moments, that he had already begun to suspect he would come, before this weekend's end, to know Edmund Thorncastle rather better than the banker's own family had ever troubled themselves to do. By morning, the house was cheerful again in the thin autumn sunlight, breakfast was served, and Edmund Thorncastle did not come down. Chapter 3. The Locked Library. It was Hodges, the butler, who found him, a fact he was to repeat, with increasing embellishment, to every constable, reporter, and curious neighbour for the remainder of his days in service. At 9:30, Mr. Thorncastle not having appeared for breakfast, a state of affairs sufficiently unusual to cause comment, Hodges had gone to the library, where his master customarily retired after his morning coffee to attend to correspondence before the household stirred. The library door was locked from within. Hodges knocked, then knocked again, and receiving no answer, fetched Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who fetched Gerald, who, after some minutes of increasingly urgent shouting through the door, put his shoulder to the old oak panel until the lock, worn with age, gave way. Edmund Thorncastle sat in his armchair by the cold hearth, his head fallen forward upon his chest, a half-empty glass of whisky overturned upon the small table at his elbow, its contents long since soaked into the Turkish rug beneath. He might have been asleep, save that no amount of shaking, no amount of Mrs. Pruitt's rising, horrified cries would wake him. By the time Poirot descended, summoned by the commotion, moving with a swiftness that surprised those who knew him only by his fastidious, unhurried manner, the household had gathered in a shocked and murmuring knot in the hall, and the colonel, white-faced, was attempting to keep order among them. "A seizure," Gerald was saying, again and again, in the too loud voice of a man trying to convince himself. His heart, he always said his heart would go one day. The amount he— "Nobody is to enter the library," Poirot said, and something in his quiet voice cut through the confusion with an authority that silenced even Gerald's protests. "Colonel, I beg you, telephone at once to the local police. And nobody, monsieur, madame, is to touch the glass, the bottle, anything upon that table." "You think," Renner began, his grey face gone greyer still, "I think, monsieur, that it is not yet the moment for thinking. It is the moment for care." Poirot stood in the doorway of the library, his sharp eyes travelling with methodical slowness over the scene. The locked door, now broken, the cold, undisturbed hearth, the overturned glass, the papers upon the desk, squared with the same obsessive neatness Poirot himself might have employed, save for one sheet, half covered by a paperweight, that lay askew, as though pushed aside in haste. He noted, too, the window, closed and latched from within, and the single armchair, angled not toward the fire, as a man reading alone at night might sit, but toward the door, as a man might sit who was expecting, or dreading, a visitor. Inspector Colin Reeves arrived from the village within the hour, a solid, sandy-haired man of perhaps 40, methodical and not, Poirot was relieved to find, unduly resentful of a foreign detective's presence in his investigation. Once the colonel had made the necessary introductions and vouched, at some length, for Poirot's reputation. "Heart trouble's what the family will say, and what half the county will believe," Reeves said grimly, crouching by the body while the police surgeon made his preliminary examination. "But I don't like that glass, Monsieur Poirot, and I don't like that door being locked from the inside with the key still in the lock. If a man's heart gives out sitting in his chair, he doesn't generally trouble to lock himself in first." The police surgeon, a brisk young man named Dr. Farrow, looked up from his brief examination with an expression that confirmed the inspector's suspicion before he had spoken a word. "I can't say for certain until the analysis is done," he said, "but the pupils, the pallor, the state of the lips, I'd stake a good deal this isn't heart trouble, Inspector. There's something here that wants a chemist's report, and quickly." Poirot, standing very still in the doorway, allowed his eyes to travel once more, slowly, around the room, the whisky decanter upon the sideboard, 3/4 full, the single soiled glass upon the table, the small, silver-framed photograph of Mrs. Thorncastle upon the mantel, and beside it, half hidden, a second, smaller frame, empty, as though a photograph had recently been removed. "Non, mon ami," he said softly, more to himself than to the inspector. "It is not the heart that has failed Monsieur Thorncastle. It is, I think, someone very much closer to him than his heart has ever been." He remained a moment longer in the doorway, unwilling yet to disturb the room further, his eyes travelling once more over the small, telling details that would not, he suspected, mean a great deal to the local constabulary, but which seemed to him to speak with a peculiar eloquence. The dead man's dressing gown, laid across the back of a second chair, suggested he had meant to retire shortly after taking his whisky, and had not expected to be detained in the library much past midnight. The correspondence upon the desk, save for that single askew sheet, was arranged with the fastidious precision of a man who liked his affairs in order, and yet the room itself, for all its surface neatness, held an atmosphere Poirot could only describe, groping for the word, as unsettled, as though its very furniture had borne witness to something it could not itself relate. "You are very quiet, Monsieur Poirot," Inspector Reeves observed, straightening from his own examination of the body. "I am listening, Inspector," Poirot said. "A room such as this one, where a man has died in circumstances not yet understood, has a great deal to say to those with the patience to hear it, though I confess it does not yet speak clearly enough for my satisfaction. We must be patient, you and I, and we must be very thorough, for I think this house holds more secrets within its walls than its cheerful gravel sweep and its handsome facade would ever lead a casual visitor to suspect." Chapter 4. The Poison in the Glass. The analysis, when it came 2 days later, confirmed what Dr. Farrow's trained eye had already suspected. Edmund Thorncastle had died of digitalis poisoning, a substantial dose dissolved in the whisky he had been in the habit of taking each night before retiring, sufficient to stop a healthy man's heart within the hour. "Digitalis," Inspector Reeves repeated, turning the word over as though it left an unpleasant taste. "Foxglove, that is, in plain English. Common enough in any country garden. There's a bed of the stuff not 50 yards from this very window, Monsieur Poirot. I noticed it myself coming up the drive." "A poison, then, that required no great cunning to obtain," Poirot observed, "only the cunning to administer it, and the coldness to wait through a long evening for its effect." They sat together in the small study the inspector had commandeered for his interviews, a modest room adjoining the library, its walls lined with the ledgers and correspondence files of the estate, which Reeves had already begun, with methodical patience, to examine. "The whisky in the decanter's clean," Reeves went on. "Whoever did this doctored the glass itself, or the small measure he poured from it, not the bottle, which tells me 2 things. First, that they knew he'd be alone when he took it, and drink from no other glass that night. Second, that they didn't much care if he suffered before it took hold. A slower poison, dissolved thin, would have let him call for help before it stopped his heart, and nobody heard a sound from that library all night. Unless," Poirot said quietly, "someone did." He recounted, then, the sound he had half heard in the small hours, a door closing somewhere below, that he had dismissed at the time as the ordinary settling of an old house. Reeves made a careful note, though his face showed the particular scepticism of a policeman confronted with evidence too faint to build upon. "And the library door locked from within," Poirot continued, "the key still in the lock when it was broken open. This troubles you, Inspector, as it troubles me. If Monsieur Thorncastle locked that door himself, it was because he expected, or feared, an intrusion he wished to prevent. He locked it, I think, after his visitor had gone, sat down with his whisky, believing himself safe from further interruption that night, and did not know that the poison had already been placed in the glass before ever he raised it to his lips. So we're looking for someone who was alone with him, or near enough to that glass, sometime in the evening before he retired," Reeves said. "That narrows it a fair bit, but not near enough. Half this house had reason to seek him out privately, by what I'm hearing already, and not 2 hours into my inquiries. He was not wrong." The interviews that followed, conducted through that grey, subdued Sunday while the household moved about the corridors of Ravensmere Hall, in the hushed, unnatural quiet that follows sudden death, revealed a family, Poirot reflected, listening from his chair in the corner of Reeves's makeshift office, saying little, missing nothing, considerably less united than its outward harmony at dinner 2 nights before had suggested. Mrs. Thorncastle, questioned first, answered in the flat, controlled voice of a woman holding herself very carefully together, and volunteered nothing beyond what was asked. Gerald, questioned second, grew first defensive and then, under Reeves's patient pressure, tearful, and admitted, reluctantly, and only when the inspector produced a letter found among the dead man's papers, that he owed some £400 to bookmakers in London, and that his father had that very week refused, for the first time, to pay the debt. "He said I'd had my last chance," Gerald said, white about the mouth. "Said tomorrow, that is, Saturday, the day he was going to settle everything, once and for all, and I'd have to make my own way after that. I didn't kill him for it. I hadn't the nerve, if you want the truth. And besides, what good does his death do me now, with Renner and the lawyers picking over every penny?" It was a fair question, Poirot reflected, and one that would want a very careful answer before this matter was done. Chapter 5. The Ledgers of Charles Renner. Charles Renner submitted to questioning with the same grey, correct composure he had shown at dinner, but Poirot, watching from his unobtrusive corner, observed that the banker's partner held his hands clasped rather too tightly in his lap, and that his answers, though precise, came a fraction too quickly, as a man's do who has rehearsed them in the sleepless hours of the night before. "I had every respect for Edmund," Renner said, in answer to the inspector's first general question. "We built the bank together, from a single office in Lombard Street to what it is today. I will not pretend our partnership was without its disagreements. What partnership of 20 years is? But murder, Inspector, is a very great distance from disagreement." "And the nature of these disagreements, Mr. Renner?" Reeves asked, mild as milk, though Poirot had come to recognize the particular mildness with which the inspector approached a question he considered important. Renner hesitated, the first hesitation Poirot had observed in him, and then, seeming to calculate that evasion would serve him worse than candour, said, "I had begun, some months ago, to notice certain irregularities in the private accounts, sums transferred to purposes I could not trace, entries that did not balance against any client instruction I could find record of. I raised the matter with Edmund directly, some 6 weeks past. He told me," Renner's jaw tightened, "he told me it was a private matter, of no concern to the bank's solvency, and begged me to trust him a little longer. I am not, Inspector, a man who finds it easy to trust a partner's books on faith alone, however long our friendship." "How much money, Mr. Renner, are we discussing?" "Difficult to say with precision. The entries were not made to be easily traced, that much I will say, but taking the transfers I have been able to identify, across perhaps 3 years, I should think not less than £11,000. Reeves gave a low whistle, and even Poirot's carefully composed features registered the sum. £11,000 was, in 1934, a fortune sufficient to ruin a lesser bank outright, and to place a very considerable strain even upon one so well established as Thorncastle and Renner. "And had you," Poirot asked quietly, speaking for the first time in some minutes, "discovered where these sums had gone, monsieur?" Renner's eyes flicked to him, wary. "Not with certainty, but I had begun. Forgive me, this is conjecture only. I had begun to suspect a private establishment somewhere outside London. Regular sums at regular intervals to what I took to be a private account, quite separate from any business Edmund and I conducted together. I confess I had begun to wonder, He stopped himself. To wonder, monsieur, if Monsieur Thorncastle maintained a second household, Poirot finished for him gently. Renner's silence was answer enough. I intended to raise it with him formally, before the partner's solicitors, this coming week, Renner said at last, low. I told him as much, 3 days ago. I did not expect. He broke off, passed a hand across his face. Whatever you may think of my motives, Inspector, I will say this plainly. A dead partner is of very little use to me. My own capital is bound so closely with the bank's fortunes that Edmund's death, and whatever scandal follows the unravelling of these accounts, may very well ruin me, along with whatever remained of his reputation. I had every reason in the world to want him alive, and forced at last to answer for what he had done. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, discussing the interview with the Colonel over a subdued luncheon, a curiously persuasive argument. And yet, arguments of interest, however persuasive, had a way of concealing as much as they revealed. A man ruined by a partner's death might, after all, have killed him in a fit of anger before calculation had time to assert itself, or might, more coldly still, have killed him precisely because the alternative, public scandal, the slow bleeding away of 20 years' reputation before lawyers and newspapers, was a fate considerably worse than the quicker, quieter ruin of a partner's convenient death, timed and managed before the auditors could be called in at all. You are frowning, Poirot, the Colonel observed over the cold ham and pickle. What is it that troubles you about Renner's account? Only this, mon Colonel. A man who has spent 6 weeks nursing a grievance so grave that it threatens both his fortune and his friend's reputation is not, generally, a man content to wait patiently for a solicitor's appointment. Such grievances have a way of demanding earlier and more private resolution, a confrontation in a quiet room, perhaps, rather than a formal meeting before witnesses. I find myself wondering, mon ami, whether Monsieur Renner intended to wait for his solicitors at all, or whether he had already resolved, before ever this house party began, to have his answer from Edmund Thorncastle a very great deal sooner. There is also, Poirot added, half to himself, buttering a roll with the particular precision he brought to all small tasks, the small matter, mon Colonel, of where those £11,000 were truly sent. Monsieur Renner suspects a second household. I think perhaps he is not wrong, though I think also that he does not yet suspect how very close that second household has come to Ravensmere Hall this weekend. Chapter 6. The Girl Who Walked from the Station. It was Cynthia Thorncastle, the poor niece, who first mentioned, in the offhand, unguarded manner of a woman long accustomed to being overlooked in any room she occupied, the small oddity that Poirot had, in fact, already marked for himself. "It's only that I thought it strange," Cynthia said, when Reeves pressed her, gently, for anything unusual she might recall from the evening before Thorncastle's death, that Miss Ferrand should have walked from the station at all. Uncle Edmund was, the most particular man about such things. He sent the motor for every other guest, even Mr. Renner, who lives not 20 minutes from the village, and might easily have walked himself. But when I mentioned to Uncle that Miss Ferrand's train was the same as the Colonel's, and might she not share the car, he said, rather sharply for him, that Miss Ferrand had written to say she preferred to walk, and that I was not to trouble myself further about the arrangement. "You found this odd, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked. "Only that I hadn't known Miss Ferrand had written to him at all," Cynthia said, frowning at the memory. "I engaged her myself, you see, through an agency in London, for my music lessons. Uncle Edmund suggested the agency himself, now I think of it, quite out of the blue one evening, said he'd heard good things of a French tutor they had on their books. I wrote the arrangements. I never knew Miss Ferrand had corresponded with Uncle directly at all. It was a small thing, The sort of small thing, Poirot reflected, that a less patient investigator might have let pass entirely, and yet it settled, with a satisfying and ominous precision, into the shape that had been forming in his mind since the alcove conversation he had overheard 2 nights before. He found Miss Ferron that afternoon in the small music room, sitting at the piano though she was not playing, her hands resting quiet upon the closed lid, her dark eyes fixed upon nothing in particular beyond the rain-streaked window. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, seating himself, uninvited, in the chair nearest the instrument, "I think it is time you and I spoke plainly with one another." She turned to him, and for a moment he saw something flicker across her carefully composed face. Not guilt precisely, but the wariness of a creature long practiced in concealment, deciding whether concealment still served her. "I don't know what you mean, monsieur," she said, though her careful, precise English wavered very slightly upon the words. "I mean, mademoiselle, that I stood in the corridor 2 nights past, quite by accident, and heard Monsieur Thorncastle beg you to wait until Monday before you spoke to the others, and heard you tell him that he had made such promises before, when your mother was yet living to hear them." Poirot's voice was gentle, but there was no gentleness in its persistence. "I mean that you did not come to this house through Miss Cynthia's agency at all. Whatever letter was shown to satisfy her curiosity, but at Monsieur Thorncastle's own private arrangement, made directly and kept carefully from the rest of his household. And I mean, mademoiselle, that a woman does not walk 2 miles from a country station in the cold rather than share a comfortable motor car with strangers, unless she has very particular reasons for not wishing to arrive in company. Reasons, perhaps, connected to a face she fears might, upon close observation, tell its own story before she is ready for it to be told." The girl's hands, resting upon the piano lid, had gone quite white at the knuckle. "You are very observant, Monsieur Poirot," she said at last, low. "My name is not Alice Ferrand. It is Rose Vane, and Edmund Thorncastle, monsieur, though the law and the world never knew it, was my father." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The rain had begun again outside, tapping softly against the glass, and somewhere below in the house a door closed, and footsteps crossed the hall, and life continued in its ordinary fashion, quite unaware of the small seismic admission that had just occurred in the quiet music room above. "I have carried that name, Ferrand, for exactly 6 days, monsieur," Rose said at last, her composure returning to her by visible effort, as though she were drawing it about herself like a cloak against the cold. "I chose it myself, from a novel my mother once loved. It seemed, at the time, a small enough deception, in service of a much larger truth I meant, eventually, to tell. I did not anticipate that I should find myself confessing it, instead, to a detective, in the wreckage of my father's murder, before I had ever had the chance to speak it to the people who most deserved to hear it from my own lips. Grief has a way of overturning the most careful plans, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "I think you did not anticipate a great many things about this weekend, when first you agreed to your father's arrangement." "No," she agreed, very quietly, "I did not." Chapter 7. The Second Mrs. Thorncastle. The story came slowly, and not without long pauses in which Rose Vane sat looking down at her own hands, as though she might find, in their careful stillness, some strength she did not otherwise possess. Her mother, Margaret Vane, had kept a small bookshop in Bath, and had met Edmund Thorncastle, then a rising young clerk, not yet the great man he was to become, some 26 years before, in the years before his marriage to Beatrice, though he had not told her so at the time, nor for some years afterward. "He told my mother he was a widower," Rose said, her voice level with the particular flatness of old well-worn grief. "It was only after I was born that she learned the truth, that there was a Mrs. Thorncastle already in London, and that he had no intention whatsoever of leaving her. My mother might have exposed him then, ruined him, if she'd chosen to make it public. A bigamous promise, even if no marriage had actually taken place, would have been scandal enough to sink a man rising in the city as he was. She chose instead to accept what he offered: a house, quietly maintained, an allowance, paid with scrupulous regularity, and his word, which she believed, then, that one day, when it was safe to do so, he would acknowledge me properly. And this day, Poirot said quietly, never came. There was always a reason, Rose said, and now some of the old bitterness broke through the flatness of her recital. First it was his own career, that a scandal would ruin before it had properly begun. Then it was Gerald's christening, and he could not have his legitimate son's name touched by talk of his existence. Then it was the bank itself, newly founded, that could not survive the whisper of impropriety in its principal partner. There was always a reason, monsieur, and I grew from a child who believed every one of them into a woman who believed none. My mother died 2 years ago, of a wasting illness, and very little money to ease it, whatever fine words he wrote in his letters of regret. And I came here, in the end, because I had nothing left to lose by coming, and because I meant, God forgive me, to see him shamed before the people he had chosen instead of us. And so you wrote to him, arranging this visit under a name not your own, through an agency you had never in truth applied to. He arranged it, Rose corrected, with a faint, bitter twist of her mouth. When I wrote to tell him I meant to come to Ravensmere and tell his wife everything, whatever the cost to either of us, he begged me instead to come as a guest, under an assumed name, ostensibly to teach his niece music, so that he might have time, he said, to prepare his family properly before any revelation. I agreed, because I believed, one final, foolish time, that he meant, at last, to keep a promise. And then, the night before he died, he told me to wait until Monday. Always a little longer, monsieur. Always one day more than I could bear to wait. Poirot studied her in silence for a long moment. The pale, controlled face, the dark eyes that held, beneath their wariness, something that might have been despair rather than calculation. "Mademoiselle," he said at last, "I must ask you directly, where were you, upon the night your father died, between the hour the gentlemen rose from their port and the small hours of the morning?" "In my room," Rose said, "alone. I have no one who can speak for me, monsieur, save that I tell you plainly I did not go near the library that night, nor near any whiskey glass, and that whatever hatred I carried for what he had done to my mother, I did not want him dead. I wanted him ashamed. I wanted him, before God and his own family, to say my mother's name aloud and admit what he owed her. A dead man, monsieur, cannot make such a confession. His death has robbed me of the only thing I ever truly wanted from him. And yet, mademoiselle, you must see how such an account will appear to those less inclined than I am to weigh a person's character alongside the bare facts of the case. A woman with a grievance 26 years in the making, alone in this house under a false name, with no one to confirm her whereabouts on the very night her father died. It is not, I think, a position you would have chosen for yourself, had you known how swiftly events would overtake your careful plans. "No," Rose said, with a faint, exhausted smile that held no humour in it at all. "I imagined, when I agreed to come here, that the worst that might befall me was a scene at the dinner-table, and perhaps Mrs. Thorncastle's very justified fury directed at my head. I did not imagine I should find myself, within 24 hours, suspected of murdering the very man I had travelled here to shame into honesty. There is a bitter irony in it, monsieur, that I have not yet found the strength to properly appreciate. It was, Poirot reflected, walking slowly back through the darkening corridors of Ravensmere Hall toward Inspector Reeves's makeshift office, either the plain truth of a woman with nothing left to hide, or the very cleverest lie he had yet encountered in a case already rich with concealment. He found, turning the matter over in his mind, that he was not yet prepared to say which. Chapter 8. The Housekeeper's Confession. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who broke first among the household staff. Not from any complicity in the crime itself, Poirot judged within moments of her tearful arrival in Reeves's office that evening, but from the accumulated weight of a secret she had carried, unhappily, for a very great deal longer than the 2 days since her master's death. "I should have spoken sooner," she said, twisting her handkerchief between reddened fingers. "Only, I didn't like to speak ill of the dead, nor to stir up trouble that was none of my affair. But I can't rest easy another night with it on my conscience, not with poor Mr. Thorncastle lying dead and a murderer walking free in this house." "Speak freely, madame," Poirot said, gently. "It is precisely such small silences, kept from misplaced loyalty, that allow murderers to walk free." Mrs. Pruitt's account, delivered in fits and starts and frequently interrupted by fresh tears, concerned an evening some 3 weeks past, when she had come upon Mrs. Thorncastle in the small sitting-room adjoining her private chamber, a letter open upon her lap, weeping in the particular silent, controlled manner of a woman unused to permitting herself the indulgence of tears at all. I asked was there anything I could bring her, and she said no, quite sharp, and put the letter away in her writing desk. But not before I'd seen, quite by accident, that it was in a hand I didn't recognize, and signed M.V. at the bottom, and that it mentioned a sum of money, and a promise made and broken. I thought no more of it at the time, save that the mistress seemed changed after that evening, quieter and watchful in a way she hadn't been before, as though she was waiting for some blow to fall that she couldn't prevent. "M.V.," Poirot repeated softly. "Margaret Vane." "I don't know the name, sir, only the initials," Mrs. Pruitt said. "But there's more. The mistress asked me, not a fortnight ago, to engage a private inquiry agent from London. Very quiet about it. Swore me to secrecy. Said it was a private family matter and Mr. Thorncastle mustn't know. I made the arrangements myself. The agent's report came by post only last Tuesday, the very week of the house party." Reeves leaned forward sharply. "And do you know what that report contained, Mrs. Pruitt?" "No, sir. I never saw it. Only that the mistress read it alone in her room, and came down to dinner that same evening looking, if you'll forgive me saying it of my own mistress, like a woman who had received her death sentence and was determined nobody should see her flinch." Poirot and the inspector exchanged a long, weighing glance. "It would seem, mon ami," Poirot said quietly, once Mrs. Pruitt had been shown out, still dabbing at her eyes, "that Madame Thorncastle has known of her husband's second family for very much longer than she has permitted anyone in this house to suspect, and that whatever private inquiry agent's report reached her only days before her husband's death may have told her a great deal more than the bare fact of his infidelity. It may, I think, have told her that the woman calling herself Alice Ferrand, sitting at this moment in the music-room of her own house, was in truth her husband's daughter by another woman entirely. You think she knew Rose Vane's true identity all along?" Reeves asked. "I think, Inspector, that a wife who has engaged a private agent to investigate a mysterious payment, and who receives his report only days before a stranger arrives in her house under a false name at her husband's private arrangement, is a wife very well placed indeed to have put 2 and 2 together, and a wife so placed has motive enough and opportunity enough for a great deal more than mere tears behind a closed door." They summoned Mrs. Thorncastle before the hour was out, and this time Poirot noted. She came into the room already armoured. Her earlier composure hardened now into something closer to defiance. The look, he thought, of a woman who has decided that concealment has served her poorly enough already, and means now to choose, very carefully, what she will and will not confess. Chapter 9. What the Widow Knew. "Very well," Beatrice Thorncastle said, seating herself with the deliberate composure of a woman determined not to be seen to break. "I will not insult either of your intelligence by pretending ignorance any longer. Yes, I knew of Margaret Vane. I have known, not from the beginning, God knows, but for a good many years now, that my husband kept a second establishment, and that a child had been born of it. I bore it, gentlemen, as women of my generation were taught to bear such things, with silence and with what dignity I could manage, because the alternative, public scandal, the ruin of my son's prospects, the collapse of everything I had spent 30 years building alongside my husband, seemed to me a far worse fate than private humiliation quietly endured. And the report you received from your private agent, madame, only days before Monsieur Thorncastle's death?" Poirot asked. Something flickered across her controlled face. "You are very thorough, Monsieur Poirot." "Yes." I had begun to suspect, from certain remarks Edmund let fall, his insistence upon this particular music tutor, his evident anxiety in the days before the party, that something had changed, that the arrangement I had lived with for so many years, at arm's length, was about to be brought, uninvited, into my own house. I engaged the agent to learn what he could. His report confirmed what I had begun to fear, that Margaret Vane had died, that her daughter had written to my husband threatening exposure, and that the young woman my niece had engaged as a music tutor under the name of Alice Ferrand was, in fact, that very daughter, brought to Ravensmere at my own husband's arrangement, and under my own roof, without so much as a word of warning to me. This knowledge, madame, must have caused you very great distress." "Distress?" Mrs. Thorncastle gave a short, bitter laugh, entirely without humour. "Monsieur Poirot, I have spent 30 years as Mrs. Edmund Thorncastle. I have hosted his dinners, borne his son, smiled at his partners, and asked no questions I did not wish answered, because I understood, long ago, that my husband was a man who required a wife's discretion a great deal more than he required her love. And in return for that discretion, I truly believed, that whatever else he was, he would never bring his shame into my own drawing-room, to be gossiped over by the very society I had spent my life cultivating. When I learned he had done precisely that, had invited his other daughter into my house, under a false name, to sit at my own dinner table, I confess to you, gentlemen, that something in me which had endured a great deal for a great many years, endured no further. You confronted him, madame? I did, the very night he died. Mrs. Thorncastle's chin lifted, defiant even in confession. I went to him in the library, late, after the other gentlemen had gone up. I told him I knew everything, the girl's identity, the years of payments, all of it. I told him that if he intended to acknowledge her, as I believed by then he did intend, whatever comfortable lies he had told her to keep her quiet a little longer, he would do so over my strenuous objection, and at the cost of every remaining shred of the life we had built together. And how, madame, did Monsieur Thorncastle respond to this? He wept, Mrs. Thorncastle said, and for the first time something genuine broke through her armour. Not grief, precisely, but a kind of exhausted contempt. Great, self-pitying tears, Monsieur Poirot, of the sort he had not shed, to my knowledge, in 30 years of marriage. Tears for his own guilt, I think, rather than for either of the women he had wronged. He begged my forgiveness. He swore he meant to provide for the girl quietly, discreetly, without public scandal, and that I need fear no exposure. I told him I did not believe him, that he had made such promises to that woman for 20 years and broken every one, and that I saw no reason his second daughter should fare better than his first wife had. And then I left him, monsieur, alive, sitting in his chair with his whiskey, exactly as Hodges found him the following morning, save that when I left that room he was weeping, and very much alive, and I have not one soul in this house who can confirm that I speak the truth. Did he say anything else to you, madame, in those final moments? Anything that struck you, at the time or since, as significant? Mrs. Thorncastle was silent a moment, her eyes fixed on some point beyond Poirot's shoulder, as though she were once more in that room, watching her husband's bowed, weeping shoulders. He said one thing I have turned over in my mind a great many times since, she said at last. He said, "Beatrice, I have spent 30 years building walls between the people I love, thinking I was protecting them, and I have only now understood that I was protecting nothing but my own comfort." I did not answer him. I did not, at the time, believe he meant a word of it. I had heard too many fine speeches from Edmund Thorncastle across 30 years to trust one more, however sincerely delivered. I wonder now, gentlemen, whether I did him a final injustice in that disbelief, whether he meant, truly, to change, and whether my own refusal to believe him was the last small cruelty in a marriage that had by the end very little kindness left in it on either side. Chapter 10. A Clock That Told Two Stories. It was in the small hours of that same night, turning the confessions of the day over in his mind, while the great house settled into its uneasy silence, that Poirot found himself drawn back, as he so often was at such moments, to the library itself, now cleared for the household's use once more, though Reeves had left it, at Poirot's particular request, otherwise undisturbed. He stood a long while before the cold hearth, reconstructing in his mind's eye the scene as Hodges must have found it, the locked door, the overturned glass, the armchair angled toward the door rather than the fire. He examined, with his customary meticulous attention, the small ormolu clock upon the mantelpiece. Stopped, he noted with sudden and particular interest, at 17 minutes past 11. "Curious," he murmured aloud, and was still murmuring when the colonel, roused by his friend's restless pacing along the corridor, joined him with a dressing gown thrown hastily over his nightshirt and a candle in one hand. "Can't sleep either, eh, Poirot? Grim business, all of it. Mon ami, tell me, this clock, was it always kept precisely wound, to your knowledge?" "Thorncastle's own particular fetish," the colonel said, peering at it. "Wounded himself every night before retiring. Wouldn't let a servant near it. Said a man ought to know the time in his own house without trusting another soul's hands for it. Odd sort of pride, but there it is." "And if it stopped at 17 minutes past 11, Poirot said slowly, "we might suppose this to mark the hour of his death, since a dying man's hand, or a dying man's final movement in his chair, might easily have jarred a clock so close beside him on the mantel." He paused. "And yet, mon colonel, Madame Thorncastle tells us she left her husband alive, and weeping, at an hour she believes to have been closer to midnight, after the servants had retired, and after, by her account, both her son and Monsieur Renner had already gone up to their rooms for the night." "Someone's lying, then," the colonel said, with the particular relish of a man who has, for once, followed a piece of detective reasoning to its natural conclusion. "Or," Poirot said, very softly, almost to himself, "someone has been a great deal cleverer than lying alone would require." He crossed to the mantel and, with great care, examined the little clock more closely, turning it gently in the candlelight, running one finger along its gilded edge. This clock, mon colonel, has been moved. See here, the mark upon the mantel's dust, very faint, where it customarily stood some 2 inches further to the left. Someone has taken it up and set it down again, not quite where it began. Good Lord, you mean someone stopped the clock deliberately, set it to a false hour, to throw suspicion elsewhere? I mean, mon ami, that whoever administered the poison to Monsieur Thorncastle's whisky did not do so at 17 minutes past 11 at all, but at some other hour entirely, an hour perhaps that would place a particular and inconvenient guest very much closer to the library than that guest would wish the police to know. And I mean also, Poirot added, his sharp eyes glinting in the candlelight with the particular pleasure he took in a puzzle beginning, at last, to yield its shape, that whoever moved this clock possessed the coldness of mind, even in the immediate aftermath of murder, to consider very carefully what story the room itself would tell in the morning, which suggests to me a murderer very much more calculating than a spurned mistress's grief, or a gambler's desperate impulse, or even a wounded wife's midnight confrontation would generally allow. He set the little clock back precisely where he had found it, disturbed dust and all, and stood a long moment in silent thought. "Tomorrow, mon colonel," he said at last, "I think we shall gather this household together, and I shall tell them a story about a clock, and a locked door, and a promise 26 years in the breaking, and I believe, before that story is done, we shall know at last which among them could not bear to hear it told." Chapter 11. The Music Tutor's Secret Skill. The morning brought with it a fresh development that Inspector Reeves delivered to Poirot over a hurried breakfast, his sandy brows drawn together with the particular satisfaction of a policeman who believes, at last, that he has found solid ground. "I've had the local constable making inquiries in the village, Monsieur Poirot, as you suggested, about that young woman's movements before she ever arrived at the hall. And here's a rum thing. The chemist's assistant remembers her calling in, the very afternoon before the house party began, asking about foxglove, digitalis that is, wanting to know, she said, whether it was true the leaves could be dried and used medicinally for a weak heart, as her mother had once told her. The chemist's assistant thought nothing of it at the time, gave her the usual answer, and thought no more of it until my constable came asking questions." Poirot's expression did not change, though something in his eyes sharpened. "And has she a particular knowledge of such matters, this Mademoiselle Vane?" "That's the thing of it," Reeves said. "I put it to her straight this morning, and she didn't deny it. Said her mother had been something of a herbalist in her later years, made her own remedies, taught Rose a fair amount of the old country lore about plants and their properties. Said it was idle curiosity, nothing more, seeing the foxglove bed in the Ravensmere Gardens and thinking of her mother. But it's a very particular sort of idle curiosity, Monsieur Poirot, in a house where a man was to die of that very poison not 24 hours later. It is indeed a very particular curiosity," Poirot agreed slowly, "though I would remind you, Inspector, that a murderer clever enough to move a clock and construct a false hour of death is not, I think, a murderer careless enough to announce her interest in digitalis to a village chemist's assistant on the very afternoon before she means to use it. Such carelessness sits uneasily beside such calculation." "Unless," Reeves said, "the carelessness came first, an unpremeditated inquiry, innocent enough at the time, and the calculation came after, once the deed itself was done, and she'd time to consider how to cover her tracks." "It was," Poirot conceded, turning the matter over as he walked alone through the damp autumn garden an hour later, a possibility he could not yet dismiss. He found himself, almost without conscious intention, standing before the very bed of foxglove the inspector had mentioned, tall, handsome spires of purple-pink flower now beginning to fade with the season, growing in cheerful abundance beneath the library's very window. He crouched, with the particular disregard for his own immaculate trousers that only a matter of real importance could induce in him, and examined the bed closely. Several stems, he noted, had been recently broken, not by wind or careless gardening, but cut cleanly, with something sharper than a casual hand would employ. So, he murmured to himself, someone has indeed gathered what they required from this very bed, and gathered it, I think, not idly, but with purpose. He straightened, brushing the damp earth from his knees with visible distaste, and stood a long moment gazing up at the library window above him, calculating the distance, the visibility, the ease with which a figure might stand at this very spot, unseen from the house, and reach the flowers required for a fatal dose. It was as he stood thus, lost in calculation, that a voice behind him made him turn. "You are wondering, monsieur, whether it was I who cut those flowers." Rosevane stood a few paces off, wrapped in a grey shawl against the morning chill, her dark eyes steady upon his own. "I am wondering a great many things, mademoiselle," Poirot said carefully. "Among them, whether you might tell me plainly, did you cut these flowers?" "No," she said, without hesitation, and then, after a pause, "But I know who did, monsieur. I saw them, 3 nights past, from my window, after midnight, when I could not sleep for thinking of what I meant to say to my father the following day. I saw a figure below, at this very bed, cutting something in the moonlight, though I did not think, at the time, to wonder why, and I did not see their face clearly enough to swear to it in a court of law. But I saw enough, monsieur, to know it was not the figure of a man." Chapter 12. Gerald's Confession. Rosevane's testimony, uncertain as it was, sent Inspector Reeves back to his interviews with renewed and rather grim purpose, and it was Gerald Thorncastle, summoned once more before the inspector that same afternoon, who broke first, though not, as it transpired, over the matter of the foxglove at all. "You want to know where I was that night, past midnight," Gerald said. His earlier bluster entirely deserted him now, his young face haggard with 2 days' accumulated strain. "Very well, I'll tell you, though God knows it does me no credit. I was in my father's study, not the library, mind, the smaller study across the passage, going through his private drawer, looking for the letter about my debts, meaning to destroy it before he could use it against me in whatever announcement he meant to make. You stole into your father's private papers, monsieur, on the very night he died?" Poirot asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I did, and I'm not proud of it, but I'll swear before any court you like that I never went near the library, never touched his whiskey, and that when I left the study, empty-handed as it happens, for I never found the wretched letter, the library door was already shut, and so far as I could tell, quiet. I heard no voices. I saw no light beneath the door. For all I know, my father was already dead by then, sitting alone in that room, while I hunted through his desk not 20 feet away, thinking of nothing but my own troubles." His voice cracked. "That's a thought I'll carry a long while, Inspector, whatever else comes of this." "What hour was this, Mr. Thorncastle?" Reeves pressed. "Gone midnight, I should think. Perhaps a quarter past. I didn't look at a watch. I was too occupied with not being caught." A bitter, humourless smile touched his mouth. "There's an irony in it, isn't there? Sneaking about my father's study like a common thief, terrified of being discovered, while somewhere close by, someone else was doing something a very great deal worse, and no one thought to fear discovery at all." Poirot, listening closely, found himself struck by a small but significant detail in Gerald's account. "You say the library door was shut, and no light showed beneath it. Was it, to your observation, locked at that hour?" Gerald frowned, casting his mind back. "I couldn't say for certain, I didn't try the handle. Why should I have? But now you mention it." He paused, working through the memory with visible effort. "I don't believe it can have been locked, monsieur, or not yet, at any rate, because I recall now that as I came back along the passage from the study, I heard the faintest sound of the library door's own lock turning, the particular stiff click that old lock always made, the very lock Hodges had to break through the following morning. I thought nothing of it at the time, assumed my father had simply retired for the night and locked up behind him, as he sometimes did. And this was at what hour precisely, monsieur, as near as you can now recall? 20 minutes past midnight, perhaps 25. I remember because I heard the hall clock chime the half hour only a few minutes after I'd regained my own room." Poirot sat very still for a long moment, his sharp eyes fixed upon nothing in particular, while in his mind the small scattered fragments of the case, a stopped clock reading 17 minutes past 11, a widow's confession of a confrontation she placed near midnight, a son's account of a lock turning at 20 minutes past, began, at last, to arrange themselves into a pattern whose shape he did not entirely like. "Inspector," he said quietly, once Gerald had been shown out, "I believe we are very close now to the truth of this matter, and I believe also that the truth, when it comes, will surprise this household a great deal more than any of the suspicions they have so far entertained of one another." He rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the darkening garden where, somewhere beneath the failing light, the foxglove bed still stood, its purple spires nodding faintly in the evening breeze. "Consider, Inspector, what we now possess," he said, half to himself, half to Reeves, who had settled back in his chair with the patient attentiveness of a man who had learned, over the course of this investigation, that Poirot's musings, however circuitous they seemed, generally arrived somewhere useful in the end. A clock moved to record a false hour. A lock turned at 20 minutes past midnight, when, if young Gerald's account is accurate, and I see no reason to doubt it, the room beyond that door had already fallen silent. A wife who confesses to a confrontation she places near midnight, and a secretary who saw her, vial in hand, a very great deal earlier than that. There is a discrepancy here, mon ami, of some 2.5 hours, and I think when we have accounted for every minute of that gap, we shall have accounted also for the murderer. You think Mrs. Thorncastle's lying about the hour, then? I think, Inspector, that everyone in this house has told us a story constructed, whether from guilt or from simple fear, to place themselves as favourably as possible within the timeline of that terrible evening, and that our task, now, is not to determine who has lied, for I begin to suspect that very nearly everyone has, in some small particular, but to determine whose lie conceals a murderer, and whose conceals only an ordinary, forgivable human frailty. Chapter 13. Vivian Marsh Remembers. It was the secretary, Vivian Marsh, summoned almost as an afterthought amid the more dramatic revelations of family and fortune, who provided the detail that at last allowed Poirot to complete his reconstruction of that fatal evening. "I don't know that I have anything of importance to add, Inspector," she said, composed as ever, though Poirot noted the faint shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights since her employer's death. "I retired early that evening, before 11 certainly, my duties for the day being complete, and I heard nothing further until the commotion the following morning." "And your duties that day, Miss Marsh, did they bring you into the library at all, in the hours before Mr. Thorncastle retired?" "They did, as it happens. I brought him some correspondence to sign, shortly after the gentleman rose from the port, perhaps 9:30, or a little after. He was alone in the library at that time, the whisky decanter already set out upon the sideboard, as Hodges customarily arranged it each evening. "And the glass, mademoiselle, was it already poured at that hour?" Miss Marsh considered. No, monsieur, I am quite certain of that, because I recall him rising to pour his own measure just as I was leaving the room, remarking, as he sometimes did, that a man in his position could at least be trusted to pour his own whisky without a servant hovering over him. He poured it himself then, at approximately 9:30, and you left him alone with it. I did. Though, she hesitated, frowning slightly, as though only now recalling some detail she had not thought significant before. There is one small thing, monsieur, though I hardly know if it signifies. As I left the library that evening, I passed Mrs. Thorncastle in the passage outside, coming, I supposed, to see her husband before he retired. I thought nothing of it. A wife visiting her husband of an evening is nothing remarkable, save that she was not, as I would have expected, dressed for retiring herself, but still in her dinner gown, and carrying, rather oddly I thought at the time, a small vial of some sort in her hand, of the kind one might use for medicinal drops. Poirot's stillness, in that moment, was absolute. A vial, mademoiselle? Are you quite certain? Quite certain, monsieur. I remarked it particularly because Mrs. Thorncastle is not, to my knowledge, a woman troubled by any illness requiring medicine, and I wondered, idly, whether it was meant for Mr. Thorncastle rather than herself. He had complained, once or twice that week, of a certain irregularity in his heart's action, brought on, he said, by the strain of his private affairs. And this was at what hour, Miss Marsh? As I say, shortly after 9:30, some considerable time, therefore, before the hour Mrs. Thorncastle has apparently told you she went to confront her husband. Miss Marsh's composed face showed, for the first time, a flicker of genuine unease at the implication of her own words. I had assumed, monsieur, that hers was simply an earlier, separate visit from the one she has described to you, a brief good night, perhaps, before she went up herself, and then a second visit, later, for the confrontation she has confessed to. I did not think, until this moment, to wonder whether there might have been only the one visit, and whether her account of its timing to you has not perhaps been entirely accurate. Poirot rose slowly from his chair, his mind working with the swift, silent precision that Colonel Ames, watching from his own corner of the room, had learned over their long friendship to recognize as the sign of a case very near its conclusion. Mademoiselle, Poirot said, you have been of the very greatest assistance. I believe, Inspector, that we have now very nearly the whole of it, save for one final piece, which I think we shall find, if we look for it carefully enough, in Madame Thorncastle's own private effects. Chapter 14. The Vial. The search of Mrs. Thorncastle's chamber, conducted that same evening with Reeves's warrant and Poirot's quiet, methodical assistance, yielded, within the half-hour, precisely what Poirot had by then come to expect. A small glass vial, tucked at the back of a locked jewellery case, empty now save for the faintest residue of a bitter, greenish tincture that the police surgeon, summoned once more, identified within the hour as a concentrated preparation of digitalis, considerably stronger than any medicinal dose a physician would ordinarily prescribe. "Where did you obtain such a preparation, madame?" Reeves asked, when Mrs. Thorncastle was brought once more before them, her composure, at last, beginning visibly to fracture. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes fixed upon the small vial lying upon the desk between them, as though she might, by sheer force of will, make it disappear. "I have suffered, gentlemen, from a weakness of the heart myself, these past several years," she said at last, very quietly. "A private physician in London prescribes me a tincture of digitalis, in careful, measured doses, for the condition. I have taken it, safely, for a considerable time. It did not occur to me, until very recently, that the very medicine keeping my own heart beating might serve, in sufficient concentration, an altogether different purpose. You are telling us, madame, that you poisoned your husband's whiskey with your own heart medicine. I am telling you, Mrs. Thorncastle said, and now the tears she had held so carefully in check throughout 2 days of questioning came at last, though her voice, remarkably, remained steady even as they fell, that I went to him that evening, at 9:30, as your secretary has evidently told you, not at midnight as I claimed, carrying my medicine, quite innocently, meaning only to take my customary dose before I went in to speak with him. And I found him already pouring his whiskey, humming to himself, entirely unaware of the storm I had come to bring down upon his head. And in that moment, gentlemen, something in me that had endured 30 years of quiet humiliation simply broke. He turned away for a moment to fetch a paper from his desk, and I do not fully know, even now, what possessed me. I acted, I think, before I had properly decided to act at all, in the manner of a woman moving in a dream. I poured a measure of my tincture into his glass while his back was turned, and I do not believe to this hour that I fully intended it as murder in that first instant. I told myself, even as I did it, that it was only a little, that his heart was strong, that perhaps nothing at all would come of it save my own private, furious satisfaction at having, for once in 30 years, taken some action rather than simply enduring. Then I left the room before he had turned back, and went up to change, and came down again near midnight, as I told you before, to confront him properly, with words this time rather than poison, not yet knowing, God forgive me, that the poison had already done its work, and that I was addressing, by then, a man already dying, or perhaps already dead, in the very chair where I found him weeping. The tears you described to us, Poirot said softly, the confession of guilt, the promises of discretion, these all occurred, then, after the poison was already in his blood. I did not know it, Mrs. Thorncastle said. I swear to you both, I did not know it until Hodges broke down that door the following morning, and I understood, all at once, with a horror I cannot begin to describe to you, exactly what I had done the night before, and exactly why my husband had seemed, in our final conversation, so strangely pale, so unsteady upon his feet, as I left him a second time. "And the clock, madame?" Poirot asked very quietly. "The clock moved from its place upon the mantel to tell a false hour of death?" For the first time, genuine bewilderment crossed Mrs. Thorncastle's ravaged face. "I touched no clock, Monsieur Poirot. I know nothing of any clock. I did what I have confessed to you, and no more, and left that room believing my husband very much alive." Poirot sat back slowly in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing with the particular intensity of a man who has, quite suddenly, seen the true shape of a puzzle beneath the shape he had believed it to hold. "Then, madame," he said softly, "I think there is a second visitor to that library we have not yet properly accounted for, one who came after you had gone, found your husband already dying or dead, and who possessed, even in that terrible moment, the coldness of mind to rearrange the evidence of the room before ever raising the alarm." Chapter 15. The Second Visitor. The household summoned that evening to the drawing-room at Poirot's particular request, Reeves standing grave and watchful by the door, the little detective himself pacing, in the manner Colonel Ames had come to recognize as the prelude to revelation, before the cold hearth received the news of Mrs. Thorncastle's confession, with the particular hushed horror of people who have spent 2 days suspecting one another, and find the truth, when it comes, considerably stranger than any of their private theories. "Madame Thorncastle has confessed," Poirot said, once the initial shock had subsided into a tense, waiting silence, "to placing a fatal dose of digitalis in her husband's whiskey, at approximately 9:30 upon the evening of his death, in a moment of long-suppressed and finally uncontainable fury. This much, I believe, is the truth, and she will answer for it before the proper authorities." He paused, allowing his gaze to travel, slowly and deliberately, around the circle of pale, waiting faces. But Madame Thorncastle did not lock the library door. She did not move the clock upon the mantel to a false hour. She left her husband alive, dying, though she did not know it, but alive nonetheless, at approximately 9:30, and did not return until close to midnight, by which time, I believe, he was already beyond help, if indeed he had not already died. Someone therefore entered that library in the interval between someone who found Edmund Thorncastle dying, or already dead, and who, rather than raising the alarm, chose instead to lock the door, disturb the clock, and depart in silence, leaving the household to discover the body only the following morning. Why would anyone do such a monstrous thing? Cynthia Thorncastle burst out, her poor plain face white with distress. "That, mademoiselle, is precisely the question I have spent this evening resolving," Poirot said. "Consider, who among you, learning that Edmund Thorncastle lay dying in his chair, might have concluded that his death, rather than his rescue, served their own interests very much better? Who, finding him already beyond saving, for let us not forget, digitalis in sufficient concentration acts with terrible speed, and I believe by the time this second visitor arrived, no earthly physician could have preserved his life. Who, I ask you, stood to gain most from ensuring that death was recorded as occurring later than it truly did, at an hour that would place certain other members of this household, rather than themselves, under the darkest suspicion?" His eyes came to rest at last upon Charles Renner, who sat very still in his chair, his grey face gone the colour of old ash. "You, Monsieur Renner, told us that you intended to confront Monsieur Thorncastle formally, before the partners' solicitors, over some £11,000 of misappropriated funds, a confrontation that would very likely have ruined you both, given how closely your own capital was bound to the bank's fortunes and reputation. You told us also that a dead partner was of very little use to you. This was true, monsieur, so long as the world believed his death a natural one, or at worst a domestic tragedy unconnected to the bank's affairs. But a death occurring at midnight, after every guest and every servant had retired for the night, was a death for which no one in this house, least of all yourself, who I believe went to the library considerably earlier than midnight, to press Monsieur Thorncastle one final time upon the matter of the missing funds, could easily be blamed." "This is monstrous conjecture," Renner said, his voice unsteady despite his evident effort at control. "You have no proof whatsoever that I entered that library at all. Perhaps not yet, monsieur, in the sense a court of law would demand," Poirot conceded, watching him closely. "But consider further. You told the inspector, when first questioned, that you retired directly to your room after the gentlemen rose from their port, and did not stir again until morning. Yet Hodges, in his own account of the household's movements that night, mentions, almost in passing, for he did not himself think it significant, that he observed a light still burning beneath your door as late as 11:30, when he made his final round of the corridors before retiring himself. A man already asleep, monsieur, does not generally require a lamp." Renner said nothing, but his hands, resting upon his knees, had begun very faintly to tremble. "I have the testimony of Mademoiselle Vane, who saw from her window a figure at the foxglove bed beneath the library window some 3 nights before the murder, a figure she was certain, even in poor light, was not a man's, from its shape and bearing. This puzzled me a great while, monsieur, until I considered that a man wearing a long dressing gown, of the sort gentlemen of a certain age favour for late-night wakefulness, might very easily be mistaken, at a distance and in darkness, for a woman's silhouette, and that a partner troubled by sleeplessness, worrying over a confrontation he dreaded, might very plausibly have been wandering the gardens that same night, and noticed, as I myself later noticed, how very easily a fatal dose might be gathered from flowers growing directly beneath his partner's own window. The room had gone entirely silent, every eye now fixed upon Renner's grey, rigid face. "It was not I who poisoned him," Renner said at last, very low. "You have heard the confession yourself, from his own wife." "No, monsieur," Poirot agreed gently. "It was not you who poisoned him. But I believe it was you, arriving in that library near 11 o'clock to press your case one final time, who found Edmund Thorncastle already dying in his chair, and who, in that moment, understanding that nothing on earth could now save him, made the coldest calculation of your considerable career, that his death, properly staged to appear as occurring at midnight in a locked room, would end not only your partner's threat to expose your own long financial entanglement with him, but would also, most conveniently, cast suspicion upon every other member of this household who had reason to wish him dead, while removing, entirely, any question of your own presence in that room at the hour it truly mattered." Chapter 16. The trap is sprung. For a long moment, Charles Renner said nothing at all, and the drawing-room held its collective breath in a silence broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful call of some night bird beyond the rain-streaked windows. "You cannot prove any of this," he said at last, though the fight had visibly gone out of his voice, replaced by something closer to weary resignation. "A silhouette in the dark, seen by a girl with every reason to distract suspicion from herself. Conjecture, Monsieur Poirot, dressed up as certainty." "Perhaps," Poirot allowed, with the particular patience of a man who has, in truth, one card yet to play. "Save for one detail, monsieur, which I confess troubled me a great while, until this very afternoon, when I examined once more the small ormolu clock upon the library mantel. You will recall, Inspector, that I noted a faint mark in the dust where the clock customarily stood, a mark suggesting it had been lifted and replaced, not quite in its original position. I asked myself, why would a murderer troubled enough to falsify the hour of death not also think to wipe away such a telling mark? And the answer, I believe, is a simple one, because the man who moved that clock was not thinking, in that terrible moment, of dust and its patterns at all. He was thinking only of the hands upon the clock's face, and of the story those hands must tell to protect himself, and in his haste, in the trembling of hands unaccustomed to such work, he left upon the clock's gilded case, and upon the small key used to wind it, which I noticed lying disturbed beside it, rather than in its accustomed place in the desk drawer, the faint but unmistakable marks of his own fingers. He produced, from his waistcoat pocket, a small handkerchief, carefully folded, which he now unwrapped to reveal the little clock itself, removed, with Reeves's permission, from the library that very afternoon. "I am no expert in such matters," Poirot continued, "but Inspector Reeves assures me that the police laboratory in London possesses considerable skill in the reading of finger marks left upon polished metal, a science still young, but advancing rapidly, and already trusted by more than one court in this country. I would be very surprised, Monsieur Renner, if the marks upon this clock's winding key did not correspond, upon proper examination, to your own hand, for I observed, when first we were introduced upon the gravel sweep of this house, that you wear a signet ring upon your smallest finger, of a somewhat unusual and distinctive design, and I believe a careful examination of the marks left in the dust and upon the metal itself may show, quite plainly, the particular impression such a ring would leave. It was in truth rather more confidence than the science of the day could entirely support, and Poirot was gambling, as he had gambled before, in cases where the truth was known with certainty but proof remained frustratingly elusive, upon the greater and more reliable science of a guilty conscience confronted, at last, with the appearance of certain exposure. The gamble succeeded. Charles Renner's controlled composure, maintained through 2 days of careful questioning, broke at last, all at once, like a dam long straining against a flood it could no longer contain. "I did not kill him," he said, his voice cracking. "You must believe that, whatever else you believe of me." I went to the library near 11, meaning to tell him plainly that I would go to the solicitors myself, whatever the cost to either of us, if he did not confess the truth of those missing funds within the week. I found him. He stopped, his hand pressed briefly to his eyes. I found him slumped in his chair, barely breathing, his lips already blue. I tried to rouse him. I believe now that he was beyond help even then, though God knows I have asked myself 1,000 times since whether swifter action on my part might have saved him. And then I understood, all at once, looking at him dying before me, that his death would ruin me as surely as his exposure of my own financial entanglements would have done, unless the world believed it had occurred at some hour when I could account plainly for my own whereabouts. I moved the clock. I locked the door behind me as I left, keeping the key in my own pocket until I could return it, unseen, through the window the following dawn, before the household woke. You will find, if you look, monsieur, that the library window's latch shows signs of very recent tampering, for it was through that window I returned the key to its lock from outside, reaching through the gap I had left, rather than risk being seen entering by the door a second time. It was cowardice, gentlemen, not murder, but I understand very well that the law may draw the distinction a great deal more narrowly than my own conscience has managed to do these past 2 days. Chapter 17. The Gathering in the Library. By Reeves's particular and rather theatrical insistence, for the inspector had, over the course of the investigation, developed a considerable appreciation for the little Belgian's methods, and a corresponding appetite for their proper dramatic conclusion. The household gathered once more the following evening, this time in the library itself, restored now to its customary order, the fire burning cheerfully in the grate, as though it had never witnessed the terrible events of 2 nights before. "I have asked you all to gather here," Poirot began, standing once more before the cold hearth that had, by now, become something very like a stage for him, because I believe a case of this nature, a case built, as this one has been, upon 30 years of secrets, silences, and small unkindnesses accumulated between people who might, in a better ordered world, have simply told one another the truth, deserves to be properly and finally laid to rest, in the very room where it began. He recounted, then, with the meticulous clarity that Colonel Ames had come to expect of his friend, the whole shape of the case. Edmund Thorncastle's long-concealed second family, sustained for 26 years, at the cost of £11,000, quietly diverted from his partnership with Charles Renner. Rose Vane's arrival at Ravensmere under a false name, at her father's own uneasy arrangement, her patience finally exhausted by her mother's death, and by one broken promise too many, Beatrice Thorncastle's slow, silent accumulation of grievance, across 3 decades of dignified endurance, breaking at last into a single, unpremeditated act of poison, poured in a moment neither fully chosen nor fully resisted, and Charles Renner's discovery of the dying man, and the cold, self-preserving calculation that had transformed an accidental discovery into an obstruction of justice nearly as damning, in the law's eyes, as the murder itself. "It is a curious feature of this case," Poirot continued, his sharp eyes moving slowly around the circle of listening faces, "that no single person in this room set out, that evening, with murder fully and coldly premeditated. Madame Thorncastle acted in a moment of long-suppressed fury she herself did not fully understand until it was already done. Monsieur Renner's crime was one of concealment and calculation after the fact, not of the poisoning itself. Even Mademoiselle Vane, whom I confess I suspected very seriously for a period of this investigation, proves guilty of nothing more than the very human desire to be, at last, acknowledged by a father who had denied her that simple justice for the whole of her life." "And Gerald?" Cynthia asked quietly. "And the rest of us? Were we truly all suspected?" "Every person with a secret in this house was, for a time, a suspect, mademoiselle, and I think you will find, upon reflection, that very nearly every person in this house did indeed have a secret, some large, like Madame Thorncastle's, some small, like your cousin Gerald's debts, which drove him to a foolish but not murderous search through his father's private desk on the very night his father was dying, quite unbeknownst to him, in the room beside it. It is the particular tragedy of families such as this one, mesdames et messieurs, that secrets, once begun, tend to multiply, one lie requiring another to protect it, one silence breeding further silences, until a household that might once have spoken its griefs plainly to one another finds itself, instead, populated entirely by strangers, keeping careful watch upon one another across the dinner table. Gerald, who had sat silent and pale through most of the evening's revelations, spoke now for the first time. "I owe you an apology, Monsieur Poirot, and Miss Vane one, a great deal larger than that. I confess I believed for a time that you had settled upon her as the likeliest culprit, and I was glad of it, God forgive me, because it meant the suspicion had turned away from my own foolish business with the desk drawer. I am not proud of that gladness. Now I understand what she has suffered on my father's account. Regret honestly felt is worth a great deal more than pride never questioned, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "I think this house has learned, this week, a hard lesson about the cost of silence, and I hope, for all your sakes, that the lesson is not soon forgotten, once the newspapers have grown tired of your family's misfortunes and moved on to some fresher scandal." He turned, at last, to where Rose Vane sat, quiet and pale, at the edge of the gathered circle, neither fully within the family's circle nor fully without it, a position Poirot suspected she had occupied, in one form or another, for the whole of her life. "Mademoiselle," he said, more gently than he had spoken to anyone else that evening, "I believe your father, whatever his very great failures toward you and your mother both, did intend, in his own weak and delaying fashion, to acknowledge you properly at last. It is perhaps the only mercy available to us now, in a case with so little mercy in it, that his intention, however long deferred, was sincere at the end, even if death robbed you both of the chance to see it honoured." Chapter 18. The Little Grey Cells at Rest. It was some weeks later, the trials of Beatrice Thorncastle and Charles Renner still proceeding through the slow machinery of the law, the one charged with murder, though her counsel would argue, with some prospect of success, for a lesser verdict given the clear absence of premeditation. The other with obstruction and the concealment of a felony, a charge grave enough, though considerably lighter than the one his own cowardice had so very nearly earned him, that Poirot found himself once more in Colonel Ames's modest cottage on the edge of the Ravensmere estate, sharing a quiet glass of the Colonel's excellent sherry before the fire. A sad business, all told, the colonel said, gazing into the flames. Thorncastle built himself quite a kingdom, and it's all come down to this: his wife in the dock, his partner disgraced, his son with nothing left to inherit but a bank half ruined by the very scandal his father spent 30 years trying to prevent. It is, I think, Poirot said slowly, turning his glass in his fingers, the natural conclusion of a man who believed, all his life, that he could manage other people's happiness by careful management of what they were permitted to know. He kept Rosevane's existence from his wife, and his wife's suffering from his mistress, and the truth of his finances from his partner, and believed, I think quite genuinely, that such careful compartmentalizing was itself a kind of kindness, that he spared each of them pain by denying them knowledge. He did not understand, mon colonel, what I have come to understand across many years and many such cases, that secrets, however kindly intended, are rarely kind in their keeping. They corrode, slowly and invisibly, the very relationships they are meant to protect, until the day comes, as it always comes, when the truth emerges regardless, and finds every person it touches considerably less prepared to bear it than they might have been had it been spoken plainly from the beginning. And Rosevane? What becomes of her now? She remains, I believe, at a small hotel in the village, quite alone, though I understand Mademoiselle Cynthia has been to visit her twice this week, an unexpected kindness, from one poor relation to another, both of them having learned, I think, something of what it is to stand at the edge of a family's affection without ever quite being permitted inside it. There is some talk of a modest settlement from what remains of the estate, once the lawyers have finished their work. Not the fortune Edmund Thorncastle might once have left her, had he lived to keep his final promise, but something, at least, and an acknowledgment, finally recorded in law, of who she truly was to him. It is not justice, mon colonel. Nothing that has happened in this sad house these past weeks has been justice precisely, but it is, perhaps, as close to a fair accounting as this world generally offers. He set down his glass and rose, drawing his coat about him, for the evening had turned cold, and the last train back to London would not wait upon a detective's philosophical reflections, however well earned. "You know, Poirot," the colonel said, walking him to the door, "I confess I invited you here for a weekend's shooting, and got instead a murder, a bigamy, an embezzlement, and enough family secrets to fill a 3-volume novel. I hope I haven't put you off further visits to Ravensmere." Poirot smiled, the small, precise smile of a man well satisfied with a case properly resolved, however melancholy its particulars. "On the contrary, mon ami, it is only in houses such as this one, where every polite smile conceals its own quiet history, and every locked door its own private grief, that the little grey cells find their truest and most necessary employment. I would not have missed it for every pheasant in Surrey." And with that, he stepped out into the cold Surrey evening, leaving behind him a house at last, however imperfectly, at peace with its own long-buried truths, and carrying with him, as he always did, the particular quiet satisfaction of order restored, however briefly, to a world that seemed, in his considerable experience, forever and inventively determined to fall back into disorder the moment his attention was turned elsewhere.